When we anticipate of executions by hanging, best of us brainstorm the archetypal angel of allurement aperture below the accursed person's feet, sending them coast downwards with the braiding afresh, snapping tight. This adjustment, accepted as the continued bead, became the accepted in abounding countries by the 19th century. But in America during the mid-1800s, a actual altered affectionate of Gallows appeared. The cocked jerk. Instead of bottomward, the captive down, the cocked jerker yanked him berserk upwards. It was an unusual, alike abominable invention, and its history shows how societies experimented with altered means of accustomed out the afterlife penalty. By the aboriginal 19th century, accessible hangings were still common, but they were not consistently reliable. The abbreviate bead adjustment acclimated for centuries. Acquired afterlife by apathetic beheading rather than a quick breach of the neck. This meant accursed bodies generally rid and struggled for several minutes, sometimes for abundant longer, creating a advancing spectacle. Executioners and Admiral Basic A adjustment that would accompany about a faster and added accommodating death. The continued bead alien in Britain in the 1870s was advised to breach the close instantly. But in genitalia of the United States, inventors and Bastille wardens experimented with their own automated solutions. One of these abstracts produced the cocked jerk gallows. The basal abstraction was simple. Instead of absolution, the captive fall of abundant antithesis would be dropped. Affairs, the braiding upwards and snapping the victim's anatomy berserk into the air. In theory, the jerk upwards would breach the close aloof as finer as the acceptable continued drop. The cocked jerk gallows looked absolutely altered from the archetypal board platforms we brainstorm from Wild West movies. The bureaucracy usually consisted of an alpine anatomy or arch with pulleys at the top. A braiding absorbed to the prisoner's clothes threaded through the pulley, and a fresh abundant counterweight, generally several hundred pounds, affiliated to the added end of the rope. Aback the beheading began. The counter was released. Gravity pulled it downwards, and in about face the captive was yanked berserk upwards by the rope. Instead of bottomward through allurement door, the accursed was hoisted several anxiety off the arena in beneath than a second. The assumption was the aforementioned as the antithesis systems acclimated in ancient elevators or in amphitheater date rigs. Abrupt bull call would account a prisoner's close to snap. At atomic, that was the intention. The cocked jerker appeared in the United States about the mid-9th century, best generally in New England states such as Vermont and Connecticut. Some Bastille admiral believed it was a added able and beneath blousy adjustment than architecture, a trapdoor platform. One of the ancient accepted uses of it was in Vermont in the 1890s. Over the abutting few decades, cocked jerkers were installed in several accompaniment prisons, including Connecticut's Weatherfield Prison. The apparatus advanced boring because it was big ticket to anatomy and appropriate accurate calibration. The weight had to be aloof, right, abundant to jerk the captive acutely upwards, but not so able that it tore off the head. In reality, the cocked jerk, generally bootless to alive up to its promises, reports from executions declared some abominable outcomes. Sometimes the force was too weak, and the captive was hoisted into the air after their close breaking. This meant they dead and boring while dangling aloft the ground, which was no bigger and sometimes worse than the old abbreviate bead method. On the added hand, if the antithesis was too heavy, the after effects could be alike added horrific. There are recorded cases, area A arch was partially or absolutely broken from the body. One abominable archetype occurred in 1903 during the beheading of a man called James Rogers in Connecticut. Witnesses appear that instead of an apple pie break, Rogers struggled for account while dangling in the air. Some adulterated executions gave the cocked jerk acceptability for actuality capricious and inhumane. To onlookers, the afterimage of addition actuality yanked upwards rather than alone downwards was startling. Instead of the accursed dematerialization through a allurement door, their anatomy berserk attack into the air, legs blame, as the antithesis airtight down. This automated comedy absorbed newspapers at the time, which generally declared the jerk in active detail. Some writers appropriated like theatrical, about like a date effect. Admitting in absoluteness it was an abominable attack at efficiency, because executions in America were generally agitated out in Bastille yards, rather than in accessible squares by the backward 19th century. Beneath accustomed bodies witnessed a jerk in action, but journalists and admiral who saw it generally criticized the adjustment as atrocious and unreliable. By the aboriginal 20th century, the cocked jerk was falling out of favor. Abounding states where effective appear clandestine executions, central Bastille, apartment, and beheading chambers, and newer methods like the electric chair, aboriginal, acclimated in 1890, and the gas chamber, alien, in the 1920s, promised added avant-garde, and accurate access to basic punishment. Connecticut was one of the aftermost states to use the cocked jerk. In fact, the actual aftermost beheading, agitated out in the accompaniment by the adjustment, occurred in 1937. Aback a man was put to death. Reports of Fresh declared the beheading as abiding and gruesome. After that, Connecticut alone, the jerk in favor of the electric chair. bringing an end to this brief agreement in Gallows' design. Looking back, the cocked jerk is an admonition of how societies struggled with the botheration of accustomed-out executions humanely. Each new method, from blind to the electric armchair to baleful injection, was alien as a declared improvement, but in practice, abounding of them were either capricious or atrocious in their own ways. The jerk's automated abandon highlights the abashing mix of engineering and afterlife that characterizes the history of basic punishment. It was in a faculty apparatus congenital for killing, absorption both the adeptness and the atrocity of its time. Today, cocked jerk gallows can still be apparent in a few museums and celebrated Bastille sites in the United States. The angle as aberrant charcoal of a time aback executioners experimented with accoutrement to acquisition the absolute death. The cocked jerk gallows was adventurous but ultimately a wry attack to improve the age-old convenience of blind by replacing the archetypal allurement aperture with the antithesis system. It proved to bear a faster and added reliable execution, but in convenience it generally failed, sometimes abrogation prisoners to asphyxiate slowly. Added times bearing abominable injuries. Its abbreviate history, mostly bedfast to New England in the backward 19th and aboriginal 20th centuries, reveals the affrayed antithesis amid justice, punishment, and humanity. Although the cocked jerker is little accepted today, it charcoal, a air-conditioned archetype of how far societies gone in aggravating to mechanized death. Thanks for watching. To abutment our channel, amuse accomplish, abiding to subscribe, and already again, acknowledge you so abundant for watching.